I'm Evelyn Lee.
And I'm Janine Chastain. We're collaborating on curated conversations to explore how the industry is changing.
Together, we'll find ways to create new solutions to current challenges while elevating the value of architects.
Welcome to Practice Disrupted.
Hi, listeners. So this episode is focused on technology and change, and I'm really excited about our next guest speaker, Nels Long, because he comes from an interesting practice, and I actually met him while I was trying to find speakers for the Practice Innovation Lab, and I was looking for people that were practicing differently.
And you both have a few things in common, like you both went to SciArc.
Yeah, it was Nels graduated after me. I don't actually think we had very much I don't think we had any overlap, to be fair. But the interesting evolution of SciArc is that it brought Nels to Roto Architects. So Nels works for Michael Rotundi, who runs Roto Architects. He's also one of the original co-founders of SciArc and actually served as, for 10 years as a second director of SciArc from 1987 to 1997. Nels is one of the co-founders of a spin-off that uses a lot of technology that comes out of Roto Architects called RotoLab, which is an innovation studio for cross-sector innovation in architecture and real estate.
So today we wanted to talk about technology because we see it as one of the predominant disruptors to why the industry is changing. And we thought Nels had an interesting perspective on this topic to share.
I'm hoping that he'll talk about the variety of different ways that architects can use technology both as a tool or as a means to create new service lines for firms that they've actually put to practice. So it'll be interesting to see his take on technology, and both kind of the simplest ways that firms can innovate around it, as well as some far-reaching ideas that RotoLab is really exploring right now.
So my understanding is Roto Architects focuses on the design of buildings. What does RotoLab focus on?
So I think I'm going to leave that to Nels to respond to. RotoLab grew out of a certain necessity to, I feel like, play around or even prototype more relative to Roto Architects. Roto Architects is also interesting in itself. Michael Rotundi refers to it as a teaching studio. And I hope Nels shares about that as well. But a lot of the work that they do is actually public work. It's not private work. And they do that in collaboration with a lot of organizations. And it's through these collaborations that they've actually identified new and unusual ways to apply or reimagine how they apply technology to their practice.
What aspects of technology do you see changing in our industry?
Well, it's interesting how you pose that question, because I think there's a disruptive force coming out from outside of our industry, the Kateras of the world, for instance, that we need to keep an eye on or be a part of or integrate. But I also think there's even smaller tools that we can use to increase our productivity and our ability to deliver projects. The quickest example would be any new tool a firm adopted to work remotely over the last 2 months. I sat in at a CEO forum where an owner of a rather large firm said, if we were to have gone through the usual path, we would have had a task force to talk about remote work, to look at tools, and then 2 years later, they'd probably still be where they are now. So how do we build in the agility to look at tools that other industries are already using on a regular basis and say, how can this help my firm? So I feel like there's smaller things that we might be overlooking because we aren't taking the chance to explore them. And then there's larger opportunities that we're just not seeing because we don't think broadly enough, alternatively.
Yeah. And Evelyn, I think you have such a unique perspective on this topic because you're working for a leading tech company that's doing things from an innovation standpoint. And you have access to a lot of things that most architecture firms don't. I'm assuming you can probably see some of the gaps between where an industry like technology is versus an industry like architecture is. I would imagine there are some interesting observations you could make.
Yeah, I mean, so a really great simple example of that was I got a laptop my first day, right, of work. So I was completely mobile to begin with. I think people have struggled with that even through the transition. But what really got me excited at a very dorky level was the fact that there was several different applications that I didn't have on my laptop. One of them being the Adobe Suite. And and I was used to like, okay, now I'm going to have to build a business case. I'm going to have to send a letter. I'm going to have 5 meetings.
You have to make them financial argument.
Right. And granted, I work at a technology firm that's the idea of spending extra money on additional license. It doesn't weigh as heavily as a smaller medium firm, but I sent in a help desk ticket and literally 10 minutes later, they installed it on my machine. So it just removed a lot of headache and processes that I think we've unnecessarily overlaid in architecture firms that we don't need to spend our time on that we don't make money spending time on allocating software licenses to people. So how do we automate that process so we can spend more time where we make more money? And another thing that we use is this whole idea of a single sign-on, SSO, which is widely used, right, in the technology industry because they can take away and revoke your rights to any system across your computer, like instantly, right? Like if I were to leave my firm tomorrow, they get rid of my single sign-on and I can no longer access any of the software tools as I can today. I think if some IT people in firms today, or if some people who wear the hat of the multiple hats that include the IT person in their office, think about like what it takes to decommission a computer or to make sure that they taken back all the access that they've given to employees, like even that becomes a much larger process.
As you're describing your IT team, I'm remembering different scenarios that typically play out in architecture firms around technology, including the remote consultant that a firm might work with on a month-to-month basis that usually comes in for emergencies. Or in a few instances, I've seen an architect or designer actually play the dual role as the designated technology person. And they end up being responsible for setting up the computers for new hires and then also having to get drawings done. And then, of course, there's the large firm model where they have a designated technology department, which can range from a small team to a large network of people across the firm. And in that case, of course, they have more resources than a small to medium firm. But I find it interesting to think about the ways in which architecture firms are designing the people resources that they're putting around technology.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Yes. And if Nels doesn't touch on that, maybe that's another episode for us in season 2.
So what do you want to get out of this conversation with Nels?
So Nels brings a really interesting case study as a practice that is doing different things with technology and looking at how to implement technology differently. And I'll probably say it multiple times throughout this. You know, I kind of fed up with the fact that the first words that come to mind when architects think about technology is Revit, CAD, BIM, VR, AI at a very limited scale, by the way, because the applications to AI are so much more tremendous than how architects even think about it. But those are our go-to technology responses, and I feel like we are missing out on bigger and better opportunities, but we're also missing out on small things that can increase our productivity, and accelerate just our ability to do things on a daily basis too. So I'm hoping that he brings to light kind of like a variety of all those things, and talks a little bit about how firms can consider bringing those technologies in-house.
So Nels Long is our guest today, and he is a SciArc grad from 2014. And Nels is a designer, strategist, and educator with a passion for projects that seek to improve the world through a relationship between technology and the built environment. As an associate principal at Roto Architects, Nels has worked on projects at numerous scales, from single-family homes and commercial spaces to large civic projects and master plans. His approach to practice is the basis for founding Roto Architects' innovation studio, RotoLab. Through RotoLab, Nels has co-founded companies that each focus on a different relationship between architecture, technology, and neuroscience, specifically focusing on learning through virtual experiences, virtual tooling, and social and competitive spaces for virtual experiences and games.
That's really interesting. Let's hope he touches on that.
I know, it sounds exciting. Let's listen to the interview.
It would be great if you could open up the conversation by telling us a little bit about yourself and the type of practice that Roto Architects is.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, guys. I met Michael Rotundi in 2012 when I started at SciArc as a post-professional candidate in the Emerging Systems Technology and Media program. And Michael was teaching a course on the role that video games play in design, as a new frontier for architects, as a new scope of work for designers, as a new tool for influencing architectural design. And through I think I took 3 or 4 courses from him during that time, we began to outline a possible future for architectural practice that was more based in the startup world, that was more based around projects as opposed to companies and careers. And we focused on a couple technology solutions initially. This was right at the very beginning of virtual reality becoming available commercially. We were still working with the Dev Kit 1 for the Oculus Rift at that point. Vive had not come out yet. And we were building a program called Second Studio, which grew out of my thesis project at SciArc, which essentially was virtual reality design tools and collaboration software for members of architecture, engineering, and construction, which is now available open source on GitHub. And I'm sure that these ladies can make that link available at some point. So that was really the basis of our collaboration, the foundation of our practice together. And through that process and through subsequent ventures that we undertook, we began to define an alternative practice for architecture that was more disruptive and began to challenge the norm of what architects are expected to respond to, types of services they're expected to offer, timeframes they're expected to work under, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's really where I come from in entering into the conversation today, is having spent the better part of the last 10 years developing alternative practice out of our LA office, and now establishing a new presence and a new office in Northern California based out of Sonoma County, looking to take advantage of all of the opportunities that are here and leveraging our connections in Los Angeles as well.
Great. So tell us a little bit about kind of the evolution, I guess, of Roto Architects. And, you've said that you didn't work, like you've never really worked in a traditional practice. So how would you define Roto Architects now, I guess?
It's kind of an inside joke among our team members, is that Roto Architects is the traditional firm and RotoLab is where we do all the fun stuff. And that's not exactly fair, because we do a lot of fun stuff in both. RotoLab is more focused on technology and on more out-of-the-box solutions, again, kind of following that startup mindset of pursuing individual ventures. Roto Architects has been for the majority of its lifetime been a teaching practice, a finishing school in a sense for young people that are coming out of graduate school, that are either not ready to start their own firms, or it's really it's a mentoring space for people like Michael and his partners and my fellow principals and I, to get to test out some ideas in the same way that you would in an architectural studio at school. And it's very heavily driven by narrative. It's very heavily driven by storytelling, and really developing a personal connection with the client, developing a personal collaboration with the client and all the stakeholders. And through that process, we've delivered some pretty amazing, what I would consider traditional projects. Traditional in the sense that there's a contractor and there's a host of consultants and there's a client or two, and we go through the same project delivery processes as any other firm in the country, but we bias that process towards the conceptual at every step, and oftentimes sacrifice or assume some additional risk in order to further that mentality. So Roto Architects, which was founded in 1991, has always been focused on providing architectural solutions for nonprofit organizations, for the underrepresented, for Native peoples, and for school districts and organizations that are philanthropic organizations and so forth. We have our large civic projects, we have our large commercial projects, but our sweet spot is really in serving that underrepresented community.
So RotoLab was kind of the idea that you and Michael talked about, kind of incarnate then, like playing out in parallel with Roto architecture. Why did you make the active distinction to make them two different things? Like, why did you feel that was necessary? Has that been helpful? Has that been hurtful?
I think it's all of the above and none of the above. I mean, so we still find ourselves in a situation where we are justifying its existence. Well, why don't we just do this under the umbrella of Roto Architects? Why do we need a separate entity? And really, the reason why RotoLab has persisted as a legal entity, as a separate company, not as a department or as a team within Roto Architects, is it's provided a legal medium for Michael and my collaboration and the collaboration of other contributors that have worked on our ventures. And so it is in its primary form an equity sharing device that allows for us to develop sweat equity relationships with other contributors, whether they're neuroscientists or they are interaction designers or musical instrument designers or composers or whatever their domain of expertise is. They are working towards some stake in RotoLab, and that has really freed us up to get away from a fee-based organization. Architects typically, they only do work for fees. And so what we've been exploring, and more so in the last 3-4 months or so, since the stay-at-home mandate and pandemic and all that stuff, is leveraging other financial devices that are available to us to keep work moving forward even when there's no money. And one of those is equity sharing and profit sharing. And RotoLab, being a separate company, allows for us to have a partner or a principal type relationship with people that are not licensed in a cross-sector, multi-domain setting in a way that an architecture firm could not. So that's become its primary role, is really as that collaboration device.
So I have this kind of thing that I cringe about, especially being in a technology firm, that when architects talk about technology, it's usually it's very specifically about Revit or BIM or VR and AI in a very limited capacity. Nels, you and I have had several conversations on kind of how architects should be leveraging technology further. So from kind of even a basic standpoint of you were talking about Jira and other Zoho and other forms of technology. What do you think architects should be investigating more these days in terms of technological applications to their practice?
I think the kind of the holy grail in technology for the design fields at this point is unlocking the power of the gig economy in a way that the software industry has. The gig economy being rideshare drivers, software programmers, people that can, as free agents, contribute to some product or some service on a case-by-case basis, on a project basis, on a time basis, without becoming a long-term dependent upon that company and that company's financial resources. And that is, that's largely beneficial to both parties, to the company that the work is being done through, and to the free agent. It gives them a lot of freedom, and oftentimes free agents, they make a lot more money because they're not tied to the success of one firm or another. They're able to negotiate their own rates. And there's been a number of products that have attempted to do this. There's a paper that came out of Stanford 2 years ago that was looking at gig economy for design professions. The problem with design professions is, unlike programming or Uber driving, is that it really requires a robust institutional knowledge of that firm's style, of the people that they're working with, of the client, of the jurisdiction. And so solutions that have been proposed to create networks of project-based employees, as opposed to companies that take on multiple projects, companies of people that take on multiple projects, require almost like a film production company, this level of commitment, this level of research and subscription to the institutional approach to aesthetics and community values and things like that. And so I think that's really the direction that everyone is working towards, whether they honestly know it or not. I mean, I know you just mentioned you don't really want to talk about Revit, but I think that's one of the things that Autodesk is really striving for through Autodesk 360, BIM 360, whatever it's called, the cloud-based BIM, the ability for multinational integrated project delivery teams that include stakeholders and contractors and subcontractors and everybody working as one, the ability to share building information models across the cloud, and having people contribute in their area of expertise without needing necessarily to understand and comprehend the project as a whole. I mean, that's one of the tools that is going to facilitate a more decentralized workforce within the architectural community. I think what is very ironic about that, however, is that the tool that allows for that type of production to happen is most often cost prohibitive to the people who could benefit from it the most. There's been a number of ventures, projects, proposals that have come before us that look at ways in which groups of people can, in essence, unionize to create a union of designers, a union of architects, and share technological resources, share Revit libraries, share company benefits, health benefits, and whatnot that they aren't getting because they aren't a member of a firm, and in some ways starting to get some of the benefits of the people that are working production companies for film and whatnot within the architecture community. I think that's going to be really interesting, and it's a whole new frontier of architectural technology that hasn't really been explored yet, is the human condition and the ability to level up on the way that our teams are decentralized. We haven't spoken yet, I assume it's going to come up at some point, about the effects of working from home, the effects of COVID-19 on the architectural profession, the architectural business community. But we're seeing a lot of firms kind of meeting people halfway in this regard and saying, well, you want to be able to live where you want to live and spend time with your family and, have all of the benefits of a gig worker while still being a member of a professional organization. And a lot of firms, my firm included, has agreed that that's the best course for its employees. I mean, once this lifts, we don't have mandatory office hours any longer. As long as your work is getting done, it doesn't matter where you are. There needs to be some face-to-face time. We've mandated a certain amount of face-to-face time just because it's imperative for collaboration that you have some physical interaction, which I think we're all experiencing the lack of today. So I think there's a huge foundation that's being developed towards empowering the architectural gig economy, just as kind of a test case through this stay-at-home mandate.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to unpack there, I think. One of my questions, because the title of this going in was actually kind of risk and technology, and I feel like what you are talking about means that I mean, architects have been historically known to not want to share anything, right? So how does that really, or where do we need to take our mindset to kind of open up a project to the gig, like a project to the gig economy, and how do we change that mindset? I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but kind of this whole, the risk adverse, I think is like relative to getting sued, but for me, historically it's been interesting to see how little firms actually tell their employees, let alone like how much they're going to be willing to share, so that more people can be interactive on a model.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. There's been an extreme amount of mistrust, and I think a huge portion of it is a generational problem. For whatever reason, preceding generations have an inherent mistrust for the ones that come after. And with I don't know any other way to say it, so I'm just going to come out and say it. With the ego situation that we have in the architectural community, I feel like that's only amplified. What we've experienced through our practice, which we do define as a teaching practice, which we do define as a collaborative practice, is that there is a huge amount of trust that is gained both within the organization and without by opening up those barriers and being more transparent across the process. Obviously, we have some protocols in place in order to protect ourselves from a legal standpoint. However, more often than not, our initial action upon receiving a request for a proposal is to look for another architecture firm that's either local to the project or that shares some expertise in that particular scope, and reach out and request a partnership for that project. And so the vast majority of the projects that we do either through joint venture or through partnership with another architect. And that is partly how we are able to continue to provide innovative designs and solutions to some extremely complex problems. And I think the more that architecture as a profession gets away from the concept of I, the architect, and more towards the understanding of us as the architectural community, and begins to take advantage of some of these technological platforms that we've mentioned, like Zoho projects or Jira or some of these other collaboration platforms that were originally intended for app development, but which can be ported over to architectural design very easily. Starting to look at how we have a single informational resource that combines our in-house team, all of our consulting teams, our partner architect teams, our contractor, our client, and all the various stakeholders, where there are tasks assigned to each one and there are dependencies assigned to each task, and everyone understands everyone's role. We start to get to a point where sharing knowledge is gaining power and influence. And as architects, our role in the project process is as much controlling the flow of information as delivering a final design. And by sharing more, in our experience anyway, we've had more control over that final product.
Yeah. And I never actually thought about this until you mentioned it, but how much of a cultural shift, kind of the adoption of all these new technologies, is going to fully require. I mean, it's one thing for us to be entirely remote right now, and talk about what that does to culture, but kind of the underlying shifts in terms of, just the amount of ownership we want over anything, or the responsibilities that we're willing to give to other team members, I think is going to be interesting but necessary to make use of these technology developments.
RotoLab was exploring a venture with a couple partners a few years back for a kind of following this idea of a union of architectural designers as an online network that at its very core was based off of a transition away from the firm receiving credit for a project to the contributors receiving credit for a project. And so in the same way, when you go onto IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, and you look up, someone give me an example movie, the Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the Mr. Rogers movie, right? And then it shows all of the people who contributed,
Credits.
all the credits, the stars, Tom Hanks and the various people that were in it, all the way down to the people who were doing lighting, the lighting and the sound and the editing and etc. And then if you click on, let's say that you go down to the key grip, right? And you click on his or her name, it's going to give you a whole list of movies that they were involved in. And there's no shame in sharing credit with everybody that's involved. Everybody that when a movie gets an Oscar, everybody on that movie team gets an Oscar for their respective role. And we don't do that in architecture. And so this platform, it was called Party With Us. I was developing that with Elizabeth Wendell and Aaron Gensler out of LA. It's still something that's kind of on the back burner, but we've all become busy with other things. The premise for that was developing an internet architecture database in the same way that we have an internet movie database, where you could click on your favorite project and you could see the entire project team that contributed to it and who they're working for at the time and who they're working for now and if they're available or not. And you could theoretically contact one of those people. Like, let's say the project manager was working for this other firm at the time, but now they have their own firm. You can contact them and say, hey, I love what you did there. Can you do something like that for me? And it's just that subtle shift away from hoarding all the credit to the firm to distributing the credit to the team. It's a subtle shift. It's a sea change institutionally from an architectural professional standpoint, from practice standpoint, but from a theoretical standpoint, it's just a switch. It's just a little flip of a switch, and doing that has huge implications in the way that people interact with the architectural community or the architectural profession, in the way that projects are acquired and work is shared. And honestly, the more that you give back to the community, the more that you yourself receive, and we've experienced that in our practice, and it's one of the things that we are interested in looking towards, both from a technological standpoint, from a business standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a legal standpoint. Like, we have people on our team that represent each of those different categories, and we're kind of exploring each of these things that we're discussing from each of those perspectives.
I really want to follow up on that, because I think there's a lot of really great things that you pointed out in that, not only the generational shift, but I always think about, like, when I was working on projects and I'm in the Revit model, there's a whole team of us, and we're, if you think about it, in firms across the country, people are clicking in the models of these firms thousands of times a day, and they're completely integrated into the technology of the project. And this shift of I to we empowering the team has such an immediate impact back to the individuals who are helping to support the project development. So I agree. I think that there's a huge opportunity, and it's a cultural shift not only in the technology, the leadership, and the firm business model that has huge results that it could yield.
I think the democratization of information and the increased accessibility of technology within the architectural community specifically, but more generally, is the number one thing that is going to contribute to a future of abundance as human beings. One of the projects that we're currently working on, which Evelyn knows quite a lot about, is called Affinity Space, and it's named from the work done by Dr. James G., formerly of Arizona State University, where he was looking at the forums and wiki spaces surrounding video games as affinity spaces, as third spaces for exploring the various experiences that happen within games and the various solutions to the challenges that games provide.
Yeah. So before you go on, just because I don't think our listeners fully understand what you're talking about, let's break it down a little bit for them. This notion that there are entire like wiki fan encyclopedias, I don't even know, fanatopias, dedicated to video games and communities around them about like how you get secret objects. I don't know, Nels, if you want to dive a little bit.
Let me
deeper.
make it a little bit more accessible.
Yes, thank you.
If your hobby is remote controlled airplanes, there is a community of people online that can tell you everything about remote control airplanes, about how to build them, about how to fly them, about where you can fly them, about the local laws and jurisdictions and the varying materials that you need to investigate based on your climate and your wind situation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's another example of an affinity space. This Dr. G was focusing on affinity spaces within games, but what he uncovered are affinity spaces across the board in every sector of information, in every sector of practice, both professionally and not. And so what we have begun to develop is, in essence, an index of those various affinity spaces where members from one domain or one knowledge set have the ability to share information with members of another domain or knowledge set around epic challenges, key issues, invisible problems that are affecting people today. It's at affinityspace.com. And what we are hoping to develop is a grassroots community that is focused on leveraging the collaborative nature of architecture and design to tackle some of the key challenges that are facing the world today from a cross-sector standpoint, with domain experts acting as moderators that we've recruited to be part of it. And so some of the stuff that we're talking about here, this idea of this shift from I to we, is really at the heart of all of the work that we're doing. And this sea change away from the starchitect to, or the architect as the sole proprietor, the sole authoritarian person who has the best interest of the project at heart, to the architect as the social collaborator, the architect as the person who brings people together, the one that supports collaboration, the one that designs teams, the one that is the matchmaker and the networker, and I think that is a 21st century vision for architects, and we're starting to see the term architect get used in other industries as well. There, obviously there are software architects and there are social architects and there are policy architects and so forth, and part of the reason why is that term is just so applicable to so many different realms where there are multiple stakeholders involved and multiple domain experts involved, and you have to work with each of them to come to a solution that everyone is more or less happy with. And trying to say that one person is capable of that when there's an army of people that are contributing to that effort, I feel like it's an inevitable change. And so, yeah, through our work, we're trying to further that position.
Now, Affinity Space and even the Party with Us, I think, is two different methods of future applications of technology that actually changes. I don't want to say cultural revolution, but definitely requires kind of a cultural revolution to kind of see some success. What other applications in terms of technology in the future have you seen, or how else are you using? Are you approaching future applications of technology, and what role do architects, can architects play in that today, or should be playing it in it tomorrow?
I think there's kind of two questions there. So let me see if I'm understanding you properly, and I can kind of go down one or
Yeah,
the
I was
other.
kind of stumbling, so please
No,
feel free.
so one thing that I heard was, what are other applications of an architectural skill set? And just to respond to that very quickly, some of my students and a lot of my peers that graduated from SciArc are not architects. They are working for production designers. They're working in film. They're working in theater. They're working in game design, level design, virtual experience, environments design, user experience design, interaction design, etc. And I think what we are seeing in a large way is the whole-scale application of an architectural education to non-professional applications. And they're still architects. They still have that iterative design background. They still have that sense of space and that sense of proportion and that sense of narrative and so on and so forth. But for whatever reason, they're choosing to apply that to something other than the built environment. And as the virtual world continues to grow, we will see more and more of that. There are today architects that develop virtual projects for players of the game called Second Life, which some of you may be familiar with, which is basically just a virtual universe where you have an avatar and you can make friends and you can go to work and you can kind of do whatever it is that you want to do in the real world, in the virtual world. And some people call it escapism and some people call it fantasy and whatnot. But nonetheless, it has a massive subscription base. And in order to play at certain levels, you have to lease space or buy land, and you have to build a house, and in order to build a house, you have to hire someone to model that for you, which is usually done in a mesh modeler like Blender or Maya or 3ds Max on a computer in a physical room somewhere, and then it's sent virtually to that person and it's uploaded. And there are virtual architects that are developing virtual projects for virtual environments for virtual users. One of the things that we've been looking at, because we're just also tired of staring at our own faces in Zoom over the past 3 months or so, is how do we start to leverage some of those virtual environments from a educational standpoint, from a professional standpoint. And we're actually going to be teaching an iteration of our design studio that we call GamerLab at SciArc and ASU this fall and next spring, where we are teaching an entire studio inside of an online multiplayer game, where we're not using Zoom, we're not meeting in person, there is no physical studio. We are in the process of developing a virtual site, which will be shared, being a virtual site. We haven't decided yet, but we think we're going to play with gravity a little bit. We think we're going to play with slope a little bit. I think we're going to play with some of the physical constraints that architecture is usually concerned with. And we're going to have about 28 students coming up with virtual solutions for a virtual site, which will be critiqued in a first-person virtual environment within a game setting. And we're going to send invitations to that game environment to specialists from all over the world to walk through and play the environment and really look and see how we can leverage the existing technology within video games to provide a collaborative review space for both. We're starting looking just at schools, again, SciArc and ASU, but also looking beyond that to see how some of that technology can be ported over into our professional space as well.
That's super interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is then like my least favorite experience was always building that shared site model that all of your other models had to fit into. So taking that out of studio.
So you were the one person that ended up building the whole thing by yourself while everyone ran off and did whatever they wanted to do, it sounds like. It seems like there was always one of those people that ended up building the site model for everyone.
Well, I don't know. I think my colleagues might disagree with you on that one. I probably try to avoid it as much as I could. But just the fact that, like, I'm like, why did you, make the base so that I have to, like, put a 20-foot pedestal on my model just so I can, anyways. So you guys, my description of what's going on at Roto Architects and RotoLab, and even kind of what you just described as a virtual studio, I think is kind of cutting edge and, like, very forward thinking, which is not unexpected coming out of schools like SciArc. It's exciting to see ASU get on board too. What would be some of, kind of paring it back for our listeners, like the people, the individuals in, large firms or small shops that, just really struggled with making this remote transition? What are ways that you think firm owners can begin to test out new technology and think about new technological applications to their practice?
The vast majority of the stuff that we're talking about is either free or cheap. And while I'm not an advocate for design competitions, I feel like design competitions in a large part are kind of a brute force solution to something that is more delicate. But I do believe in the power of sprints. And this is something, Evelyn, that you mentioned earlier. I can't remember if we were recording yet or not. And most of this technology that is not available on a free basis is available on a free basis for a short period of time. And I think that for our firm's own health and success, it's important that we continue to innovate in small, short bursts, allowing time for people to understand the impact of that, how we integrate it into our current workflow, how our current clients and customers are impacted by that, and how it unlocks the potential for new clientele. So, establishing a workplace culture that supports innovation sprints, that it supports exploring new types of technology and new ways of working, or new theories around professional practice or pedagogy. And I use the word pedagogy in a professional setting. We talk about protocols and procedures and best practices as curriculum because it's the type of practice that we run. So trying something out for a short period of time, almost like a charrette in a studio. Give your team a theoretical project that maybe is a research project that can feed into a real project. That'd be best case scenario. But if that doesn't exist, then simply looking at creating something that maybe the team votes on. Hey, we'd be interested in designing a shelter for the moon, or a habitat for Mars, or something that is far enough afield that it has some entertainment value to it, and then using some new technology to explore that. If it's a new visualization technique, if it's a new collaboration technique, if it's a new project management technique, and even don't be afraid to bring the business model into this conversation and say, we'd like to explore an equity role in a project. Well, we're not going to do that on a project that's going to bring in $1 million and pay staff, for 6 months or whatever. We're going to do that. We need something small. Is there a nonprofit in the area, or is there a restaurant that needs a rehab, or is there something that I can explore a new business practice, a new technological practice, or a new professional practice in a limited capacity for a set period of time that doesn't put the future of my company at risk. And that's why we have, to get back to your initial question, Evelyn, that's why we have RotoLab. So when we discover projects inside of Roto Architects that we want to take a risk on, we shop it out to RotoLab, and RotoLab spins up a team to put together a solution for it. And if it becomes a long-term project, then it gets folded back under Roto Architects. And if it doesn't manifest into something, then it gets added to our catalog of beautiful failures. But there's no harm, no foul. There's nothing lost other than really just the time of a dozen or so people, depending on the size and scope of the project. Because, like I said, most of the time what we're doing is free, and really trying to learn in the free spaces as much as possible.
Yeah, I think the important thing there is you're talking essentially about doing mini prototypes, even, right? In a sense, consistently, right? But building that into a cultural framework. When I was talking about innovation sprints, I was talking about literally just kind of getting out of your headspace for a day or two. It is interesting, like as an application to technology, like taking that opportunity to really test out technology in a more robust way, not just hey, we're going to run this in parallel, try it out, tell me which one you like better than the other, which never really seems to work out successfully. You came out of SciArc kind of working with Michael Rotundi and this idea of RotoLab. What advice would you give to other architects? You've kind of dropped the bomb on where you think architecture needs to be headed. What is the low hanging fruit? And then where do architects really need to stretch, I guess, if that makes sense.
If there was one leave behind, it would be, individually and as an organization, seek to identify the low-hanging fruit in your region, in your market, in your practice, and establish some schedule, some goal to develop a realistic response to that. We've identified a market here for starter homes under $100,000 that we are working on a solution for. I can just about guarantee my firm 10 projects over the next 6 months if we can partner with enough contractors in enough areas to deliver starter homes, for under 100,000. That's a big ask in California. I believe that it can be done. There's huge demand for it. Everything from ADUs to, Airbnb, et cetera, et cetera. So identify that low-hanging fruit. Identify that low-hanging fruit in your clientele, in your market area, in your practice, and really work to exhaust that opportunity, and make sure that you have tried to deliver an out-of-the-box solution for that highly accessible opportunity before moving on to the next opportunity, especially if that next opportunity is a traditional opportunity. Innovation is started in the dry times, in the times where we're all kind of fighting for survival. And as soon as those first rains come in, innovation is forgotten, and we all go back to the way that we were doing things before. And I think that we, as a profession, as a community, need to make a commitment to innovation and to finishing our innovation sprints rather than setting them aside as soon as we get a project and we've got some pay coming in for a little while. So yeah, I mean, you said it before I could, Evelyn. Identify that low-hanging fruit, and as a designer and as a conceptual developer, take a stab at it, and who knows, it might be the next thing that we're all talking about.
You guys think really differently than most architects I know.
I don't know. I mean, do you know what drove you to think so different? I mean, do you know what drove you to think the way you do and still love architecture?
Yeah. I'm going to estrange some of your listeners with this comment, however, though. I was
That's okay. It's only episode 3.
I was homeschooled until ninth grade. I was raised and educated by my parents. My father, who is a ceramic artist and a 3D design professor, and my mother, who, besides just being an amazing full-time mom, was also a writer, a storyteller, cook. She still is all those things. I don't know why I'm saying it in the past tense. And for the first 13, 14 years of my life, every aspect of my life was out of the box. And I was forced to develop my own approach to everything, and my own position on everything, and my own process for achieving everything. And then when I got into architecture school, it was like a perfect fit, because it went from one process driven pedagogical framework to another, and I was like, oh, this is just like what I was doing before, except the scales, the scope is magnified. And instead of just looking at, because we use what is now called phenomenon-based learning, which is where every aspect of learning is based on a story. So Finland, for example, which is the one that is really pioneering this, in their national education system, everything is based around the narrative of climate change. And so in your math class, you're learning formulas that have something to do with the environment. In your physical science class, you're learning about climate change. In your English, in your language courses, you're exploring narrative or linguistic responses to the issue of climate change and such. So everything is oriented around that as a central theme. And that's how my mother ran our homeschool program. Everything was based around a theme, and she wrote those themes, and they were incredibly involved. And then to get into architecture school, it was just like building upon that theme, where it was fiction, and it was form, and it was space, and it was program, and it was physics, and it was all of the technology and all of these different things layered onto it. And so I found an environment in which I could flourish, and I've been incredibly lucky in that way. And if I were to speak for Michael, which I think he would be okay with, I think he would have a very similar response. Being one of, if not the youngest, in a large Italian family, I think he found himself on his own quite a lot and was forced to come up with creative solutions to environmental situations. And so we both have a very kind of similar background in that we are both autodidacts, that we both have had a huge hand in developing our own education systems, to the extent that he co-created SciArc and that whole education system. And when I say that Roto Architects is a teaching practice, that's really at the basis of all the work that we do. It's about furthering ourselves through learning, through practice, through iteration with the problem. And that's at the basis for all of what we're doing.
Nels, I think this was a very interesting conversation. I think you brought up so many really interesting points that are worth, I don't know, I think they will go through the series and hopefully relate. And we're really glad that you centered technology around culture. That was a very interesting, unexpected outcome for us, but we really appreciate that, because it was, I think it's really directly tied to this larger theme of why practice is changing.
Yeah, it's all part of the the information web, the knowledge web, and we are just part of a global system, and where culture or society tugs at one string, technology pulls on another, and to think that there's a technological answer without a cultural response, I don't subscribe to that belief. So everything is intertwined, everything is important, and everything is dependent on itself. And I think as architects, we are uniquely positioned to take that view of the world and hopefully apply some of our skills and understanding to some problems that are maybe outside of architecture. Society's got a lot of them right now, and not a lot of people stepping up to fill the gaps.
So, Janine, I know this episode took an interesting turn for you. What questions?
I have a lot of questions. And frankly, even going into it, I think what is most interesting to me is that we both had different perceptions about what the outcome of this conversation was going to be.
Right.
I remember in the early conversations of even just reaching out to Nels, I was saying, I really want to talk to him about the pivotal point of how technology changed practice, and then step into where we are now with the second wave of how technology is changing the way we work. And now, after participating in the interview and understanding your and Nels's perception about this topic, I realize that I'm thinking about technology in this very narrow way. The way you guys are describing it is much broader. I would just be interested in getting a little bit of help to further understand the stepping stones of where this conversation came from and where you were hoping it would land. Because while it was interesting to me and I took a lot away from the discussion, it's just a different angle than I was imagining. So I'm super curious what you're thinking.
Right. And I don't I hope that our listeners did get a little bit out of that. So an observation that I have is that whenever architects talk about technology in practice, it goes straight to Revit, CAD, to VR, and AI in the simplest sense of usage of those tools. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely some firms doing some really interesting things in VR, but the generic discussion around VR and architecture to me is kind of boring. Other industries have moved on to VR in a very higher level, and I also think we're missing a broader technology discussion. And some of the interesting things that Nels began to touch on but didn't fully dive deep in is just, how RotoLab is looking at technology to have a better client management, like a client management system, how RotoLab is using technology to productize some of the work that they're doing for other clients by actually bringing software to market. How RotoLab is using technology to find efficiencies and deliver new value in whole new ways, right? I mean, he was talking about the ASU SciArc studio being completely in a virtual space, which was the first time that I heard about it. But if you think about a lot of architecture schools and what they're facing in the coming semester of being totally virtual and having to make that decision, there's schools out there like the BSA that have a whole degree that is delivered virtually. But the idea that they've actually created this learning environment that you can step into in a way that we can't do on a Zoom call, or even a collaborative whiteboard, is taking it to another level for me. Which is where I would like architecture to talk about. I feel like that should be the starting point for where our profession engages with technology, if that makes sense. How do we push it further rather than being the people that are just purely trying to adopt all of the SaaS software that is current, right? Rather than being the firms that are purely struggling to whether or not I keep Revit on the server or whether I move to cloud. Those are not the innovative conversations that I want to have when we're talking about the future of technology in practice.
Sure. No, I get that. And I think the classroom example is very relevant. And I can especially see that if they had a class in studio when I was in school like that, I know a lot of people who would have taken it. And I can also see my nephew, who is going to be graduating high school soon and loves gaming, he would be really into that for sure. But if I flip it and I start to think about this as the firm owner or someone who's further along in practice, I guess what I want to know is what lessons are they going to take away from this conversation in terms of adopting or considering something in practice? And I know Nels made some recommendations about how he felt about that, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting to me about the whole conversation is that we started to talk less about technology and more about firm culture, right? And it goes back to this ability to create a culture where you're not afraid to test new things, but do it on a regular basis so it doesn't become a special event too, right? So that it literally becomes a part of the culture. So technology, I think the growth of technology and the way technology is changing is at this new and incredible pace, and that pace is only going to continue to accelerate into the future. So really, how do we create a culture that does a quick scan of everything that's out there and then pull a few ideas out from that scan and test, like, is there applications here in our firm that we can use to accelerate something that we're already doing, to take something that we're doing and turn it into something that we can sell as something else, or like create a new product. Not that they would productize necessarily their classroom, but you could see how they could take this idea of a classroom and then go around and sell it to other universities, right? As another studio space. So how do you then take that idea and productize it? Or how do you even just create something entirely new on the backbone of technology?
Well, the idea of that space, even being space you could sell within, is pretty amazing to think about. And he mentions that also in the interview, that this is another realm that exists to design, to create, and to earn money.
Oh, yeah. So he was talking about this virtual gaming site. But if you think about, there's a lot of e-commerce happening even in a game like Animal Crossings, right? Where people are paying in real money for a virtual product. I admit, I've played mobile games where I pay real money to get fake money in the game so I can buy something, whether that's additional time or
furniture for your place.
Furniture, even like furniture for your place. And that happens at in a lot of different games, not just the game he mentioned. But you could be the game developer on one end that's designing that piece of furniture that, is only available on a limited basis, and there's only various different ways that you can get it. I mean, he was mentioning this whole idea of this e-commerce space which architects can play in, which is really interesting to me. That's the first time I've actually heard that specific platform brought up in a while, but people were definitely making large amount of money selling virtual real estate at one point. There's definitely documentation of that.
I can't remember which game, but I feel like it was like Minecraft was one of them. And,
right. And yeah, Minecraft is a game that I've downloaded for my 4-year-old too. So like, it's not, they're not very intricate designs necessarily either.
So to walk it back, I think now we've gone in like one extreme of talking about virtual reality, but I also want to come back to the idea that we have architects who are in the process of, building fabrication labs. And when I left school, that was a new emerging trend. And since I've been out in practice, I've seen a lot of firms step up to purchase and invest in that type of technology and support creating fabrication shops in their studio. So between virtual reality and fabrication shops, what's the in-between in terms of technology?
There's a very unique crossover, and there's a very unique case study, and we might want to even consider them for a future episode. But Rios Clemente Hale in Los Angeles, California, has a 2-story building, and on top of the building, they have their typical architecture studio, and on the bottom, at least when I was last there, I don't know if this has changed at all, they've actually created a storefront. And a lot of what they have in their storefront, it reminds me of a museum store, but some of those artifacts are artifacts that came from their own design. So they took a textile or a pattern that they developed for the Disney concert hall, for instance, and reimagined that as a textile, and then sold the pattern in a form of a household good at a variety of different scales. There's a lot of architects doing a lot of different things with 3D fabrication that are really small and intricate, but they're also doing 3D fabrication at the building model level scale. I also came across this YouTube of these 2 DIYers, but they're making a lot of money because they took their fabrication shop, which is a combination of a CNC machine and a 3D printer, and they casted concrete coasters that they were able to sell on West Elm, and that's become an entire new line of revenue. But I don't know. I think there's different uses of technology, and I think sometimes in looking at the complexities of everything that technology can deliver, we also kind of miss out on what could be a very simple opportunity to create another stream of revenue in our services.
The thing I'm hearing from this conversation is thinking about technologies at different scales, because it breaks beyond just computer software. And there's a lot of different facets in which you can think about technology showing up in and around an architecture firm. And there's also a lot of potential. So I guess just to step into our call to action for our listeners of what they should think about getting out of this episode, I think that we both agree that it's important for firms to take a step towards assessing if they have an agile culture that's willing to support integration of new technologies, and at what levels are they thinking about that in practice? Because it's no longer good enough to not be thinking about it at all.
Yeah, I think it's to create the space to allow this type of thinking to emerge. And technology, again, is the driver of that because technology is changing. So in order for us to keep pace of technology and play in that field, how do we create the space to fully embrace it and figure out different avenues that our firms can capitalize on the technology? And not every idea is going to be a winning idea. I think we have to acknowledge that too. But you aren't going to get to that winning idea until you one of the sayings that you learn in business school is fail often and fail fast. So how do we change the culture of architecture firms to be able to do that at a smaller level by not subjecting our multi-million-dollar projects to that, but by taking little instances, micro risks, testing new ideas on a regular basis to continue to push how we apply technology to practice, and in turn grow and evolve the practice on a regular basis too. I mean, for me, that was the biggest unique thing that came out of it. Successful integration of technology is not purely the integration of technology itself. It's about creating the culture that allows for that to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And maybe we should start to talk about some of the lessons that firm owners and leaders can apply.
Yeah. So I think I think one of the things is if you're afraid of kind of dipping your toe into it, maybe start by making it a special event. And then as you have these events more often, it becomes less special, but it becomes really a part of the culture. So I talk about doing 1 or 2 day innovation sprints. If that's too much, make it a half-day innovation sprint, but take the opportunity, and it doesn't have to be technology focused. If you build this type of ideating and recreating and rethinking into your practice, then the adaptation of making changes to your technology stack is a lot easier. So like how do you do, like you said, micro risks at a lot of different scales? How do you integrate like the idea of a mini charrette and kind of build that into your culture? Design a better way to create a jack-o'-lantern, like make any holiday event kind of another idea to kind of way to test new things about how your firm collaborates and how your firm expands upon making and doing and designing.
I can certainly see it from a marketing standpoint also. As an administrative function of the firm, I oftentimes found that there was a little bit of pushback on the idea of exploring new ways to improve marketing to meet the demand that we were up against. From a technology perspective, there is a ton of potential around marketing, not just in application, but also in processes and the broader sense of technology. I think the idea of micro risks, and there's definitely potential for growth within marketing and technology, in my opinion. When you intentionally invest in marketing growth, it leads to revenue.
Right. And even in marketing, though, I think there's an opportunity for firms to figure out what their technology stack is there, right? So CMS solutions is a term that gets thrown out maybe at larger firms, but small and medium firms don't often think about their client management system. But there's a lot of CMS offerings for small firms or even the sole proprietor out there that want to, we always say architecture is about relationships, but really CMS systems that have built in AI that looks at your interactions with individuals and kind of reminds you when you need to get back in touch with them to keep them live.
I guess from a marketing standpoint and thinking about micro risk, marketing has a ton of potential to gain, and it doesn't affect the project. It doesn't affect the deliverable to the client, and it directly is tied to gaining revenue. So for me, the risk is moderate compared to the reward potential.
All right, but we don't ever talk about that, right? The first thing we talk about from a technology standpoint is never Excel and the limited use of Excel. Maybe because it's not interesting, but from an operations standpoint, I feel like we are definitely missing out on larger opportunities from other software as a service companies that are coming out.
Yeah, there is a huge market there and a lot of different offerings to explore. I know that the potential is tremendous because it's about creating efficiencies and increasing that client interaction and communication piece, which is very valuable.
Yeah. So I think that's a small way. So look at even productivity tools. Like don't even put architecture in the Google search bar. There's some architects doing some interesting things with smart sheets that are adapting it to their use. This is all very low risk, again, low monthly cost to try out. Some of them with 30, 60, 90-day free if you get on a phone call with them, but definitely at least a 7-day kind of free test drive of the product itself to see if it could work within your ecosystem and figure out at a very small level, how do you figure out a way to deliver your invoices better? I mean, and continue to do that and continue to iterate it until you found that you look back and you've really changed the way your entire practice engages and uses technology to get the work done. It's about changing the culture to both identify these things and create continual change. We have to create a culture that's okay with continual change to keep up with the technology applications that are out there. And also to understand where we might have competition, right? I've seen, even in my Instagram feed, I don't know if you've seen maid renovations, but there's a lot more of these build tech firms coming up. If you look at their websites under jobs, they're looking more for front-end engineers than they are for architects. But essentially, they're delivering virtual designs of bathrooms. They're getting them permitted and they're getting them built at a song, kind of all-in-one delivery. And they're doing it without licensed architects. So there's that too. I guess the biggest takeaway is understand the technology landscape and find ways to use it to your advantage whenever possible.
To conclude, I just want to point out a couple of key ideas. One, we all know that technology is a rapidly changing landscape. And I think that's part of the ongoing challenge. This is no longer something that you can just adopt at one point in time in your practice and then think the conversation's done. Rather, this is a conversation you have to revisit and pay attention to on an ongoing basis. Technology, and especially change, is the new norm. And so for design leaders, I think the key is looking internally at the culture of your organization and just evaluating, are these kind of conversations about change something that you're anticipating or resisting? And knowing that about your firm culture, are you allowing those conversations to happen so that you can stay relevant over time? Or are you really resistant to those conversations and preventing your firm to adapt?
Yeah, I think only then will we begin to be more relevant. Thanks for joining us on Practice Disrupted, a podcast by Practice of Architecture. Visit us at practicedisrupted.com to find out more about future episodes and the changing nature of practice. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. You can learn more about other podcasts in our community by visiting gablmedia.com. If you enjoy the show and want to hear more content like this, you can help us by leaving a rating, review, and subscribing on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget to share with your friends, and feel free to let us know what other topics or speakers you are interested in hearing about. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.